The Art of Learning series is in general, sorry, let's begin from the beginning. My name is Thomas Bespo, and I'm the resident writing consultant here at the CBS Library. My function is to help people work with their writing processes primarily. But what I've been allowed to do this year, which I'm really happy about this semester, is to talk a little bit about just general university learning practices. And the way these talks have been working is that every Thursday, I talk for about 45 minutes, roughly, in a kind of an informal way. But if you have any questions along the way, feel free to ask them. And I will repeat them so that the people online can hear them as well. They probably can't hear you. If you have any questions, if you are online, if you have any questions, then you, of course, type them in the chat. And I will try to address them as we go as well. The idea has been to try to explore some of the different competencies we develop as members of a university community, as part of our education. It's a little bit about being a good student, but it's really about being a good scholar, about becoming good at that, the business of knowing things. And so we've been grabbing hold of different aspects of that as we go. Last week, we talked about how to listen. So how to listen either to conversations or lectures or seminars. And I thought that was a really good setup for today, which is how to have conversations, how to talk, right? So I'm going to say some things about the competence of talking as a knowledgeable person to other knowledgeable people, how to know things in conversation. And then I'm going to connect that to the overall project of how to learn things at university. That's kind of the plan for today. So I hope that is I was going to say sufficient, but what I meant is I hope that is what you're looking for. All right, let's start. Let's start. So why is it important to discuss this question of talking? What does it mean to be good at talking at university? The way it fits into the general project of academic knowing is that when you know something at a university, you are in a position to hold your own, to participate, to engage in conversations with other knowledgeable people. So your teachers at university are people who are able to talk to their peers, other teachers, other researchers, other scholars. And part of their knowledge competence is that they can present often quite difficult material, interesting results to people who are qualified to challenge them on that. People who are qualified to show them where they might have gone wrong, right? What mistakes they might have made, how they could have done it better, right? So this whole discussion about truth and so forth is really a question about how good are you at presenting in various media, one of them being conversation, your knowledge results. As students, therefore, we can really, if we think about this, right, we can say, well, if I know something, I've got a number of different skills. One is I can make up my mind about stuff, right? I can look at a case, I can look at some data, I can look at a problem or a situation in real life, right? Maybe I can even just read a news article. And because it's in my area of competence, because it's something I'm studying at university, right? What I can do is I can make up my mind about what's important here, right? What's significant? What is the problem? What would be a relevant solution? So I'm able to think effectively. And that's one of the talks that we had. The other one is I'm able to write intelligently about it, right? So I'm somebody who is able to write clear, intelligent prose about these things that I know something about. So I may know I have those two skills, right? But then the question is, do I also have the ability to take this made up mind of mine, right? This articulate, literate mind of mine, and engage other people who are also serious thinkers about this subject in conversation. And that's what we'll be talking about today. Like I say, I'll speak for probably about half an hour, 45 minutes. I've got three main areas that I want to talk about. One of them is, I think you've all heard at some point in your studies that there's no such thing as a stupid question, right? But I think you've also probably heard the expression, that's a good question, right? So apparently, both things are true. There's no such thing as a stupid question, but also there are good questions, right? So it seems to be that we can say something about the quality of questions, right? And so a really important part of being able to participate in a conversation and talk to people is to be able to recognize a good question. So I want to say something about that. What is a good question? Connected to that, or in extension of that, you'll find when you're studying at university that there are certain things that become funny. There's such a thing as being witty, right? Some smart, knowledgeable people have a lot of interesting and witty anecdotes that they tell, right? Or they'll have jokes or word play, right? That is characteristic of the discipline that they're in, right? So what you'll really find is that a knowledge community, a community of knowledgeable people, has a shared sense of humor, right? There's certain things that they find funny. And there's actually a flip side of that, that the more you know about a subject, the more you realize that certain things that I want to say ordinary people or lay people, people who are not educated in your discipline, right, find funny, but it's because of their ignorance of the subject, right? So that they think certain things are funny or humorous, but because you know something about the seriousness of this issue, it's no longer funny to you, right? So that's certainly something to keep in mind, that if you are in a position, if you are knowledgeable about a subject, then you are in a position to recognize certain things as humorous, you're able to get certain jokes, and you're also no longer able to see the humor in certain other things, right? So that's a common thing to be aware of. And you use that in conversation. So that's another part of your ability to talk. Obviously, being an academic is not being a joke teller, right? So I'm not going to teach you how to be funny, but I will talk about, welcome, come on in. But I will tell you about how that sense of humor can be used to develop a conversational style, right? And then we're going to have, I hope we'll have an interesting discussion about this, or an interesting exchange about this. There's this, which is becoming increasingly interesting in academic contexts, this problem of political correctness, right? That in conversations, there are certain things that are difficult to say. And some would even say there's certain things that it's not okay to say, certain things we shouldn't talk about, right? Or if we're going to talk about them, we should talk about them very carefully, right? And that's important to keep in mind, that those issues, those topics, are specific to disciplines, right? So it's not all disciplines that find the same topics problematic, is a word that is used these days, right? So economists will find one set of things problematic, whereas sociologists may find something else, and strategy theorists may find a third thing tricky in this way. So we'll talk a little bit about that. Certainly that's an important issue to talk about. Probably about 10 or 15 minutes on each of those subjects. So we'll talk a little bit about questions, a little bit about humor, right? And then we'll talk a little bit about provocations, right? The moral foundations of our discourse. And at that point, I think it will be about 4 o'clock. And then we'll take a break. As usual, we'll take about a 5-minute break. And then you're welcome to stay until 5 o'clock, and we'll just talk. At that point, I will have turned off the camera and I'll feel less self-conscious. And then we'll just have a conversation about whatever issues that you have. But like I say, if anything comes up as I'm talking, just feel free to ask, and we'll take that on board. Good. So let's talk about the art of conversation. You've probably all had this experience, right? That you show up for class and you know what you're going to be talking about today. And the conversation begins. Maybe it's a lecture that begins, with conversation begins. And then at some point, somebody asks a question. And you, because you have prepared for class, you have read the reading for that day's class, recognize this is a question that comes out of not having read the text for today, right? So we want to say, and teachers often say this, that, just ask if there's something you don't understand, or if there's no such thing as a wrong or bad or stupid question. And yet we all have, during our studies, recognized this difference between questions that come out of knowledge of the subject and questions that come out of ignorance of the subject, right? Questions that really just reveal that the person who asked the question isn't prepared for this particular conversation, right? And sometimes a question coming out of ignorance is fine, right? It's expected. It's not something that the participants to the conversation are expected to know. So it's fair to ask those questions. And sometimes it's quite different. Sometimes we have this very particular sense that, to be qualified to participate in this conversation, you shouldn't have to ask that question, right? So questions, good and bad, really give us this sense of what is the knowledge base of our discipline. And there's a specific skill during our studies that we learn that helps to train this sensitivity, and that's developing research questions. So what we do is we say, well, why don't you go out and review a literature, have a look at what's known on this subject, right? And then articulate what is still a good question, right? Even though we have all this knowledge on this subject, right? There are still questions that are good questions to ask. Somewhere in between those just totally I'm unprepared for class questions, right? And those very well-formed research questions that are based on a lot of reading and a review of an awareness of what's out there, right? There are good and bad questions in conversation. Those questions, the good ones and the bad ones, are defined by what comes from the discipline and what happened in the conversation, right? And who the participants are in that conversation. So an awareness of what's going on in the room, as it were, right? And so we have to learn what the good and the bad questions are. And then we have to learn how to engage with good and bad questions. So what do you do with a good question, right? What do you do with a good question that you don't know the answer to, right? Does that mean, let's say somebody asks what you definitely recognize as a good question and you don't know the answer to it, right? Do you say, apparently I'm not prepared for this conversation, right? Because somebody asked a question that's a perfectly good question, I don't know the answer, right? Now, the point here is that the very act of recognizing the question as legitimate and good shows that you belong in the conversation, right? So you don't want to lose confidence at that point. And there is this wonderful phrase that we've used for millennia, I would think, which is we sort of half ironically say, that's a good question, meaning I don't know the answer, right? It's a good question, I don't know the answer. Let's see if we can find out together, right? Does anybody else in the conversation know the answer to that question? Certainly something that we'd want to know, right? So you say, I recognize this is the kind of thing that one would want to know, right? I have to admit, I don't know just off the top of my head, maybe the answer, but let's see if we can either find out later or solve it already now, right? So that's really an important thing to keep in mind with this judgment about that there are good questions, there are bad questions, that doesn't mean that anybody is immediately just disqualified or should be embarrassed, right? Because it would work both ways, right? So just be kind of generous about it, right? Be kind about it. Which gives us the other side, which is, suppose somebody asks a question and you recognize it as one that really reveals ignorance of the subject, or reveals that somebody isn't up to speed, maybe even something very trivial like hasn't been paying attention for the last 15 minutes because we just covered that, right? That kind of question, right? Which also happens. At this point, remember that what we're talking about here is a competence, right? We're talking about skill. We're talking about being good at having conversations, right? And so if you think that part of that competence is to say, that is a stupid question, right? Then you are not understanding the point, right? Because what that will do is end the conversation, right? So if you recognize that somebody has just kind of embarrassed themselves by asking a question that is outside of the knowledge base that we think is relevant for this conversation, then we don't point at it and say, well, that just shows you shouldn't be in the room, right? A good conversationalist, somebody who's skilled at using knowledge in conversation, is somebody who will move the conversation away from that question and onto some sort of more fruitful line of inquiry, right? Some other issues, in such a way that sometimes the person who asked the question won't even notice that that's what's going on, right? So you'll just say, you will recognize the question as not somewhere we should be going. I'm not gonna, at this point, if somebody asks this question, I'm not gonna start teaching this person things that are basic issues in the field. What I'm gonna do is reframe it in such a way that that it looks like an occasion to talk about something that we ought to be talking about, right? So I'm gonna move the conversation somewhere else. And the only way I can do that is if I can see all the steps between that person's ignorance, right, and my knowledge, right, the knowledge of the field, right? So being knowledgeable, being able to participate in a conversation with other people who know things, right, is a matter of seeing the line from understandable ignorance, right, to the specialist knowledge that we have in the field, right? Does that make sense? That's when we think about this art of engaging with intellectually founded questions, we're not judging, right? It's not we're not good at judging people's questions, good or bad. What we are is good at formulating good questions, right? And we're good at engaging with questions, whether they're good or bad, and giving them a place in the conversation, right? But not giving them a place that is inappropriate, right? So we're giving them an appropriate place in the conversation. One way to do that, or one useful tool to that end, is of course humor, right? And it may seem like a strange thing to emphasize, to make a big deal out of in a university setting, that we should be humorous. But certainly we should have a sense of humor, and we should be witty, right? We should have some kind of way of engaging with each other in also in a somewhat entertaining way. And our knowledge gives us the tools to do this. So one way to think about this is in terms of just references, right? So in a knowledge community, you can make oblique references, you can make indirect references to things, knowing that your audience will recognize those references, right? You can play on the meanings of words, knowing that the audience knows two different meanings of the word capital, right? Maybe the Marxist meaning of that word and the financial meaning of that word, right? And so we can make some sort of remark about that, right? the 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 reason that knowledge is such an important factor in humor is that absurdity, right? The sort of the boundary to the absurd is defined by what we know as a community. So we have a group of people. They know what things are really familiar. They know what things are common. Things belong into just ordinary background knowledge, right? Things that are not surprising if one were to say them. And so if we were to deny them, those things would be absurd, right? And that's really where we begin to be able to make jokes of various kinds. At this point, I'm realizing, and I think I'm just going to take a quick segue here, because when I was thinking about what I would say today, it didn't occur to me to have a bunch of jokes, to have a bunch of funny things to say. But that would have been quite useful to have some little intellectual witticisms that I could demonstrate this point with. And it surprises me that I wouldn't have that, but it reminds me of a kind of a fourth component that maybe we should talk about, which is if you are a good conversationalist, you have examples, right? You are good at illustrating the points that you want to make, right? So instead of just talking in the abstract about humor, you would have examples and illustrations to draw on, and they'd be at the ready, right? You would have them as part of your knowledge base. You would have examples and illustrations. There is, I think it's classic enough that I can make a reference to it. I think it's Quentin Tarantino's first movie, Reservoir Dogs, which certainly, I mean, it's a little bit violent, but it's worth seeing if one likes good movies, in which there's an undercover police detective, and he has to learn this art of going undercover, of hanging out with criminals and getting information from them. And so he's told by his mentor that he has to learn an amusing anecdote about a drug deal. And the story is I'm not going to tell the whole story because I can't remember it, but the story is he has some drugs or money that he's the mule for, that he's transporting surreptitiously in a bag of some kind. And he ends up going to the bathroom. And when he enters the bathroom, he sees 3 police officers standing in the bathroom talking. And that's the kind of the tension of that he knows he has this illegal item that he's carrying, and he has to tell the story. Of course, now this story never happened, right? This is a made-up story from a person who's never been a criminal. He's been a police officer all his life. So it's a made-up story that he has to tell. And what his mentor says, and which is a really good point, is that he has to get the details right. So he has to not say, I was in some train station somewhere. He has to say, I was in a specific train station at a specific time, at a specific year, right? And then if that's the case, you have to know whether or not that there were paper towels or hot air hand dryers in that bathroom in order to make the story convincing for somebody who might have been in that bathroom themselves at some point, right? So you have to tell the story in such a way that it has the right amount of detail, the sorts of details that somebody else would, that somebody who had actually had that experience would be in possession of, right? So one of the ways you can develop this ability is certainly by yourself, by writing stories. Make sure you don't make them up. Make sure you're writing from your own experiences so you practice this. But it's a really good idea, if you want to develop your ability to converse, to talk, is just to grab a friend or a classmate and say, I want to tell you a story, right? And then spend 5 or 10 minutes telling a story, right? Just telling the story of what happened, and just notice how hard it is to keep kind of focused and and on track the plot, because then you'll be good at generating examples. You'll be good at constructing examples. You'll be good at illustrating your ideas, right? Which I think so I kind of recovered from the fact that I didn't have any examples of humor in my in this talk, where I knew I would be having to talk about humor. Maybe we'll get back to that in questions. But do notice this, right? That in your discipline, there are certain things that are funny and certain things that are not. Notice also that there's certain jokes that are so familiar that you don't want to tell them as though you're not familiar with the fact that they're known to everybody else, right? You want to make sure that you tell them as the old joke about, instead of, hey, here's a clever thing I know, right? So you'll slowly learn what jokes are so easy to make in your discipline that they are old school, right? And then also keep this last thing in mind, which is a really good style can emerge from just not telling the joke, but from setting it up. You provide all the information, where there's an easy joke that you can make, right? There's a punchline. You provide all the illustrations, you set it all up, and then you don't tell the joke, right? You hold it back. A good style can emerge from that, right? Where you just leave it to the community to get it, right? And not go for the laugh, as it were, right? Not go for the easy laugh, right? That's and all of that is things you just become familiar with as you talk to people in your discipline. That brings us up to the last thing, which I definitely want to make sure that we talk about. And I have to say this with some seriousness and and I'm always a little bit worried when I talk about this, because there are so many opinions and emotions in play on it, which is this idea that there are certain things that you shouldn't say, certain opinions that you shouldn't hold. If you hold them, you reveal yourself to be the wrong kind of person, right? But some would say you reveal yourself to be a bad person, right? In any context. But I think it's really important to keep in mind that that our communities are very different, right? And the research communities that we end up in, and the educational situations we end up in, and the institutions we end up in, actually have different standards for this, right? So the same problem can arise in different ways, right? In this case, I'm not going to give you any examples for that exact reason, right? I don't want to pretend to know what are the issues that are sensitive, right? Because I think we all kind of know which ones they could be. I have a story about this, actually, that many years ago, not many years ago, actually a couple of years ago, I was in China giving this presentation, or similar presentation, talking about writing and knowing and such. And my sense was, and it was kind of just a vague sense, that when I presented this idea that you have to be sensitive to the idea that there's certain things that it's not okay to say, that this group of mixed European and Chinese students, right, everybody knew what I was talking about, but the Chinese students and the European students had just very different ideas about what exactly I was talking about, right? Because they both understood the idea that you can get in trouble for saying something, right? But who you get in trouble with and what happens and what kinds of things they are different things, right? And the same goes for the difference between economists and sociologists and so forth. So you basically want to develop the sensitivity to what issues do I have to be careful with? What issues do I have to learn this difficulty about? And when I say that, it sounds like a warning. It sounds like something to be afraid of. And of course, it is something to be afraid of. Careers do change. Careers are affected by the things that people sometimes even accidentally say. So people will, carelessly tweet something that they thought was funny, and it turns out not just to be unfunny, but it turns out to be offensive, right? And this may change the course of their career. There are cases of this. And so if you're interested in that, in having a career in any discipline, you want to make sure that you understand what the effect of your words will be on other people. So it does sound like a warning. It feels like a warning. And so in order to not be discouraging, there's a story I like to tell, which I draw not from my own life, but from culture. It's from a pretty famous Scandinavian story, an Astrid Lindgren character named Ronja, the robber's daughter. And so the setting is that she lives in sometime in the Middle Ages, out in the forest in a castle. She's a robber's daughter, so she lives among a gang of robbers. And I believe they commit highway robbery, like they rob people. Maybe a little bit in a Robin Hood spirit, but not. I don't think it's made very clear in the book. I think they're crooks. But they're still the good guys. Somehow, they're the heroes of the story. But they're of course rugged types. They live in a castle out there in the middle of the woods, and she reaches an age where she's allowed to go and explore the forest by herself. This age is something ridiculously young, like 12 or something like that, where she's just allowed to go out and do whatever she wants. This is the Middle Ages after all. And her father loves her very much and is concerned for her welfare. So he says, you have to be very careful down by the river. It's a dangerous place. Right? You have to be very careful by the abyss of doom, which is needless to say, a dangerous place. But otherwise, use your judgment, right? And so, what does she take from this? What does she decide it means? Be careful. The river is a dangerous place, right? Does it mean for her that she should stay well away from the river? She never goes down to the river. Does she stay well away from the abyss of doom? No, of course not. It means go right down to the edge of the river and be very careful there, right? Go right up to the abyss of doom, jump over it and back again, but very carefully, right? So do it, but in a careful, conscientious manner, right? What she does is she takes the advice of her father. There's a danger in the world. Be careful with it. Not to tell her that she should avoid it, but that she should do the opposite. She should seek it out, right? And learn how to manage it, learn how to deal with it, learn how to grapple with this danger in the environment that she lives in, right? And that's really the recommendation that I want to make for you, right? Which is understand that discourse has many dangers, right? That there are things you can say and they can get you in trouble, right? But what you should do is learn how to not avoid the issues, but how to deal with the trouble, right? Because it's a necessary ability to have. And you can help each other, right? So as students, you can help each other do this because you are in a reasonably low risk situation, right? If you are kind to each other, you can allow each other to be a little bit brave in your expression of your ideas. And so if you have certain opinions, you think they might be difficult to talk about, let each other talk about them, and make sure that you tell each other how that makes each other feel, right? How does this conversation make you feel, so that people can learn how to do it better, learn how to have those conversations better, right? Because just like it isn't a rhetorical competence to say that's a stupid question, right? And just like it isn't a rhetorical competence actually in an academic environment just to get people laughing all the time, just to tell jokes all the time, right? It also isn't a rhetorical competence in an academic environment to just cause offense or take offense all the time, right? Being offended is not an intellectual posture, right? It's an emotional reaction, right? Now, there are intellectually interesting ways of expressing and taking offense, right? That's really an important thing to keep in mind. You can go somewhere interesting intellectually with it, right? But the mere fact, the raw emotion, as it were, right, isn't part of an academic conversation. Right? So that's what you want to learn how to do, right? You want to learn how to develop that. And so my slogan here, the one that I've sort of slowly been developing, right? My slogan here is, in these situations, right, what you need to do is you need to be brave, right, in your expressions, but you need to also be kind to each other, right? So there has to be some kind of generosity, right? So be brave and be kind, right? And practice having these conversations, because you need to do that. You need to have conversations where you know that for the next 10 minutes, like, you're going to say something, and then you know for the next 10 minutes, this is going to be difficult, right? For the next 10 minutes, maybe somebody is going to get angry, right? But it's not going to be an anger that surprises or shocks you or throws the conversation out of whack. It's going to be an anger, it's going to be reaction, it's maybe even going to be some hurt that you have planned for and that you are going to now care about. And so you're going to deal with it carefully, and you will go into that situation demonstrating that you care enough to talk about this, right? So that's really the skill there, right? Is to make sure that you do it, but you don't do it carelessly, right? If you're going to offend somebody, do it on purpose, right? And remember that it also feels more serious for the person who's getting offended if you did it on purpose, right? Not that you did it unintentionally, right? And that you had some reason to do it. You had some good reason to go in this direction with the discussion. To get back to the threat part of that, or the warning part of that, remember that there is going to be, you can't go into that kind of question without acknowledging that there may be some risks and some costs. And one way of measuring whether or not you're good at having an academic conversation is, do you get through this? Do you get through this conversation so that on the other side of it, you're still peers, right? So you're still part of a collegial space, right? And I guess the test case here, where you've really professionally accomplished something, where you've really shown that you have the ability to be a scholar, right? And I'm really not saying you have to do this, right? But it would really show that it's like the limit case, right? Is where you are able to remain peers, but stop being friends, right? So we're able to lose a friend without losing them as a peer, right? Because you have to remember that some opinions are just, they're legitimate within scholarship, but they may not be legitimate between friends. So that you learn that, right? Or, and this is quite important, that sometimes you have to decide, okay, in order to maintain this friendship, right, I have to not mix this into our intellectual discussion. I have to just keep this outside of our peership, right? So I have to lose a peer on this subject, right, in order to keep the friend, right? Make sure those are two different issues for you, two different kinds of decisions you make, right? Because research does reconfigure your personal relationships, right? It is part of that conversation will change how you feel about yourself and how you feel about people, right? So take that seriously, care about it as you go forward.